About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
And this is Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it fully. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org, and Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, over the course of these programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of now, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in unconscious processes. From Jung and Freud and other earlier researchers, we learned that our minds can be thought of as having three aspects. What we are aware of, usually called the conscious mind, what we aren't aware of that keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, the subconscious mind, and what we aren't aware of that connects us and guides us in our actions, the individual superconscious. We then learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift which aspects of mind we are aware of and what we're capable of. From neuroscientists, we learned that the brain modifies whatever it receives from both the body senses and from the mind to fit past patterns of experience, following Begg's principle that neurons that fire together wire together and form what's called the default network in the brain. This all means that we see and hear and feel what we expect to, or believe we will, experience. We also learned that while it's possible to say where in the brain various processes are active, no one has yet been able to pinpoint where memories are stored or how ideas and thoughts are formed. We then saw that many responses in our body happen faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel through the body, and they often happen before we are aware of it. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of electrochemical activity in the brain, but is, in fact, the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the whole body. The brain, then, is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the senses and transmitting them to the body and the mind. We also saw some experiments that have demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. This means that we must consider mind then as a field, a pattern of energy that exists regardless of whether the body is functioning. It permeates and develops with the body and the brain as it is told by the senses through the brain what the world out there is like. This field we call mind appears to be at least partly electromagnetic because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity for several inches and even sometimes several feet around the body. And some researchers and the teachers of ancient traditions, who we call shamans, say that field looks like a glowing egg shape extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields, and some experiments have demonstrated that minds can vibrate along similar patterns. They resonate with each other. The bodies and some of the pets of people with resonant minds have been measured as changing when someone they're connected with turns attention their way, even though they can't be seen or heard. These experiments help explain how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing, the placebo effect. We've learned also that mind affects energy and matter in a variety of other ways. For example, the famous double-slit experiments in quantum physics, in which the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. For decades now, individuals have changed the patterns of numbers in what should be random grids on their computer screens or printouts, and the collective human mind has been changing the readouts from random number generators on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project. Because of the nature of fields, and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field, what Jung called a collective consciousness, Teilhard de Chardin called a noosphere, and others are calling a global brain. Some, equating mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arises, are calling it the Akashic field. They're using a Sanskrit term for the essence of everything that exists in the material world. We have also learned from researchers who are discovering that the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms can describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. Based on all of this, we explored some popular ideas like the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness has been focusing on, how we can access information in that quantum or Akashic field through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect the body and our consciousness, and how music affects the brain and the body and our connections with other fields of mind. We've looked at the role of our state of consciousness in the healing process and how we can enhance or slow down the healing process through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations. We learned how a remote viewing and telekinesis work, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync and maximizing our effectiveness. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, the books, and the authors that I mention on each show. Now, a few weeks ago, I shared the stories and discoveries of a man in mid-19th century Maine by name of Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. You may recall that Quimby learned that if he could help people overcome the beliefs that underlay their symptoms, he could help them recover from those symptoms, and that he was documented as relieving 12,000 people of their symptoms over a 15-year period. Now, Quimby's discovery was shared by a few dozen people over the next few decades, and they were refined into a set of lessons by a homeopathic physician named Mary Baker Glover Patterson. And those lessons were the foundation on which she built what is now known as the Christian Science Church, after she married Mr. Asa Eddy. But there were other people who took those ideas and lessons and applied them in a less structured, more mystical fashion. One of those was a young woman in Pueblo, Colorado, named Nona Brooks. Over a 50-year period, Miss Brooks was documented to have brought about tens of thousands of healings, to establish a college and a church, and to help turn around the Colorado State prison system, among other things. She was a popular lecturer and spoke frequently across the U.S., spent a year as a teacher and church planter in Australia, as well as helping such luminaries as Emmett Fox and Ernest Holmes get started in their ministries. I'll let her tell the story by reading from one of her articles. Come back with me to 1886, she says. I was living at that time in Pueblo, Colorado, with my sister, Mrs. Small. A close friend had been ill for some months. The physicians were not able to do anything for her, and in the spring of that year sent her to Chicago to consult with specialists. After a thorough examination, they told our friend that she was in a most critical condition, that they could not promise a healing, but her one chance was to stay in Chicago for a year and take a certain treatment. "But I cannot do that," she replied. "I have a husband and 4 little children that I cannot leave for a year." "If I were you," suggested a friend, "before I made any decision, I would try a lady here who is doing some wonderful healing. I do not know her teaching, but I know several who have been healed by her, and they were very ill, too." Immediate connection was made with Emma Curtis Hopkins, who for so many years was an outstanding teacher of spiritual mysticism. 3 weeks of study and treatment with Mrs. Hopkins brought Mrs. Frank Bingham back to Pueblo, radiant with health and joy. As soon as she could, she came across town to tell us the wonderful story. Friends and neighbors began asking Mrs. Bingham to tell them what had brought about her transformation. Informal classes grew up in response to those requests. She gave in simple language what she had learned from Mrs. Hopkins. We were always invited to these meetings, and knowing how much we needed what she was giving, she finally was so insistent that we accepted. We were, as a family, in sad condition, physically and financially, but we did not think her classes would help us, and it was most difficult for us to undertake anything of this kind. I myself was in very poor physical condition, being able to eat only very soft, especially prepared food. For more than a year I had been praying almost constantly, "God, give me light." Then, on the Sunday before we were to start our new lessons with Mrs. Bingham, I attended my church, where during the communion service the song to be sung was, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." I could not bring myself to sing the first stanza, "Nearer, my God, to Thee, nearer to Thee, e'en though it be a cross that raiseth me." I rebelled. I and my family had had all the crosses we could possibly bear. As the congregation sang, I was filled with an inner turmoil. But as the song progressed, I realized a complete surrender of myself and of the family conditions in order that I might be nearer to God, and so I was able to sing the last stanza with the others. It was during the 4th class lesson, which 8 of us were taking with Mrs. Bingham, that my whole being was completely flooded with a great light, a light brighter than sunlight, brighter than any other light I had ever seen. It filled me. It surrounded me. I was conscious of nothing but that intense white light. I thought that, of course, all in the room had seen the light too, but they had not. I alone had experienced this wonderful light, which flooded my entire being, and which, I discovered, had healed me instantly and completely. Though the actual healing was instantaneous, yet I truly believe that the months and months of praying that I might receive light had been a preparation for the healing, which had actually come to me in the form of light. I love to tell of the blessed change in outlook that came to us, of our remarkable healing, of the quick improvement of the financial situation. In fact, our entire lives were transformed. We were enthusiastic. Who would not be? We were deeply grateful for all of these blessings, and yet, while believing in nearly all of what we'd been taught, there were several points with which we were not fully in accord. One of these was, we did not believe that the visible universe did not exist, but delusion was to be denied. Our reason revolted at this, and we decided that form was the product of God's creative activity, and that this wonderful world was not to be denied, but to be understood and interpreted. We took our stand then and there, my sisters and I, in the thought that in our thinking and living we were to emphasize God and His action in our lives. We knew that no wrong thought or anything else undesirable could touch us, so long as we centered our attention on God's presence instead of on man's false concepts. There were other less important points that we saw differently. However, we were so happy in our new freedom that we said nothing about these non-acceptances. We had at that time no thought of establishing a movement. We discussed the entire subject for our own satisfaction, and in order that, when questioned, we could give answers satisfactory to our own perception of truth. And with this in view, we began our study of the visible. And it was not long before we had systematized the teaching that divine science was the first to promote it. Those are just a few paragraphs from an article that Nona Brooks wrote for one of the Divine Science magazines in the early 1900s. Nona and her sisters began to work with a woman named Melinda Kramer out of San Francisco. And Mrs. Kramer, having established the first college of divine science in San Francisco, came to Denver and helped the girls establish the first College of Divine Science in Denver. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake caused great damage to Mrs. Kramer's home and health, and she passed on in 1907, so that the Divine Science College and later Church of Denver became the center for what is now the Divine Science International Federation. One of the points that Nona makes, talking about the Divine Science Church and College, is the following. Divine science acknowledges every advance in the world of natural science, art, and religion as the further expansion of God consciousness in man. It proclaims the right of man through right thinking and true living to health, wealth, happiness, and power. It insists that these blessings are to be realized by the law that Jesus gave. Quote, "Seek ye first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." And so divine science was established. Miss Brooks, our Miss Brooks, as she was known in Denver at the time, which I think is very interesting, since the famous TV show of the 1950s was called Our Miss Brooks and set in Denver. Anyway, Miss Brooks was able to maintain, to support, to encourage, and to constantly treat for the well-being of this institution that she helped to create with her sisters, Althea and Fanny, and with Mrs. Melinda Kramer in the 1890s. Nona Brooks stayed on the planet to the ripe old age of 83, passed on in 1945 in Denver, Colorado. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how our lives could be better if we understood it more fully. I am Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me we need to look at a book and what's going on in the world today, or what you, the listeners, are curious about. Now, if you are interested in learning more about Nona Brooks or divine science, you can learn about her, her sisters, and Melinda Kramer by visiting the website of the Divine Science Federation, which is www.divinesciencefederation.org, all one word. On that site, there are descriptions of the organization and some of its member churches and teachers as well. Their creed is very simple. They call it the Divine Science Statement of Being. It goes, God is all, both invisible and visible. One presence, one mind, one power is all. This one that is all is perfect life, perfect love, and perfect substance. We are the individualized expression of God, ever one with this perfect life, perfect love, and perfect substance. And that is the essence of the Divine Science Federation and its member churches around the world. Now, as for news, There's not a whole lot I want to talk about this week, but I do regularly get questions about how we can, for ourselves, release the ideas and memories of the past and free ourselves of the symptoms in our bodies and in our environments that they're leading to. While I'm by no means 100% infallible in this process, I have experienced some remarkable turnarounds when I use what I call the express, release, replace process. I've talked about it before, and I will include a link to a summary on the Noetic Moments website. When I say express, release, and replace, what I'm saying is really a shorthand for an extended process that actually has a lot of other words in it. Starts with being aware that I'm out of balance, I'm off center, that something doesn't feel good, doesn't feel right. In systems terms, we call it a felt disequilibrium. The next step is to accept that something in my own thinking is bringing about this discomfort. And then, as I accept that it is something, beginning to realize what it is that I've been thinking. So I have to be aware and accept that my own thoughts are bringing about my distress. Once I do that, I get to acknowledge those thoughts because, frankly, I wouldn't be where I am today if I hadn't been thinking all those thoughts all along. And where I am today isn't always so awful. So I want to acknowledge them and appreciate them. And then that brings up the distressing feelings that go with those, because often what is causing me to not feel heavenly in this moment is an experience that didn't feel heavenly in the past and typically involves other people, and sometimes I can even think of myself as a victim. So I need to get into that place of feeling those feelings, feeling the upset, feeling the anger, feeling the fear, feeling the frustration, feeling the despair, and also feeling the love and the longing and the yearning and the why and how and all of those things that go along with the distress that that experience brings up. Finally, then, I can begin to release those feelings. I continue to express them until I can't find anything more in me and I feel drained. And then I can actually see or imagine them being swept away. Maybe I'll write something down and burn it or tear it up in little pieces and dissolve it. Any number of things to help me to see that I have no longer been feeling what I had felt in the past. Sometimes I'll even throw rocks and go to the ocean and go screaming or something like that. Whatever I need to do to release. And in that releasing, I can then look at the people involved and feel that there is nothing between us anymore, which is really what forgiveness is, isn't it? I'm not condoning what happened. I'm not hanging on to it in any way. I am done. It is no longer part of me, therefore it is no longer part of our relationship. And so I can look at these people in my mind's eye through the lens of love and appreciation for the role they have played in bringing me to this understanding, this moment now. And in that is what we call forgiveness, and in that we experience what I call the state of grace, which is where our power lies. And that's the light that Nona Brooks experienced. That light that fills us and fills the situation and is so full of power and life that the situation is transformed. Yes. If you want to know more about that, you can check out the link on our website, noeticmoments.org, or you can find detailed guidelines in the book called Calm Healing, which I co-authored with Robert Bruce Newman, and it's published by North Atlantic Books. And you can also find it in my book, Making the World Go Away, published by Portal Center Press. Well, that's it for today's show. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of all the titles and resources we refer to on the show, along with archives of past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful, windy Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.